Hello, I'm the Reverend Beverly Jameson, and it's lovely to be with you all again. We are going to look once more at lament and hope, and this time we're going to focus specifically on the Psalms of Lament. Last week we looked at Psalms generally. We discussed their origins and how difficult it is to actually identify the precise details, location and authors of the Psalms because of their dim and distant past. The Psalms were pulled together into the Book of Psalms by an editorial board many years after they were originally written. And the oral tradition that means Psalms were recited, learned before they were written down. We also discussed Gunkel and his new approach to assessing the Psalms in terms of his form critical. So looking at the Psalms into sort of themes, royal psalms, hymns, psalms of thanksgiving, communal laments and individual laments. And it's the laments, as I said earlier, that we are going to focus on today. The individual psalms of lament are the largest number of psalms in the Psalter. Roughly a third of all psalms are psalms of individual lament, personal lament. And I suppose in a way, because they are so personal, and if you read them as Gunkel suggested in terms of their poetry, in terms of the emotion and the feelings that the psalmist is feeling, and the emotion and the feelings that we in contemporary society are feeling, they perhaps make the closest contact to us. Why is that useful? Well, if we are going through a bad thing, in redundancy, financial difficulties, relationship problems, those emotions, those feelings are not hugely dissimilar from what a psalmist may have been feeling thousands of years ago. Yes, the circumstances may well be very different and the individuals may well be very different, but if a very close friend betrays you, that feels the same. If suddenly you or someone you love has a severe illness, and in these times of coronavirus that's very prevalent, it doesn't matter if you were around 1,000 years ago or you are around today, those feelings and emotions are relevant. Sometimes we cannot find the words to say, we cannot find what to pray. And perhaps the Psalms, therefore, have a use, a relevance, to help us put into words what we cannot say for ourselves. There's also another advantage. In our churches, whatever denomination across the board, it's largely praise and adoration, very little difference between praise and thanksgiving. The Psalms themselves are not well used within our contemporary worship. They are used in morning and evening prayer, admittedly. They are usually said in a very structured way, a very ritualistic way. But how often are the Psalms preached? How often are the Psalms used as a prayer? And that's partly because, in particular, the Psalms of Lament are saying some very hard things to God. Why is this happening? Why are you doing this? What is going on, God? It's very difficult to actually raise those issues in a contemporary worship of praise, adoration. So the Psalms have a role psychologically, in that if we are feeling anger, frustrated, afraid, worried, and we cannot find the words to express that, whether it be in our church environment, our home environment, or personally, then things fester. Now, there's lots of psychological theories, and I'm not going to bore you with them all, but one of the most well-known was from a lady called Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. You may have come across it as a bereavement cycle, a grief cycle, or those of you in business, as I used to be a corporate director and deputy chief executive of a local authority. So I used many change management tools based on the Kubler-Ross cycle. Now, I'm not saying that this particular cycle is the perfect one, and there's lots of criticism about it, but nevertheless, it does talk about stages which we go through when something bad happens to us. So the states include denial, It's meaning not happening, is it, God? Anger, that it is happening and it's hurtful and it's painful. And bargaining, if I ignore it, it'll go away. If I go to church every Sunday, will you make it go away, God? Then, of course, reality bites and people fall into a depression knowing that the situation is what it is and it cannot change. And then finally, there's an acceptance, a sort of an understanding that the situation is what it is. And it's a trigger in a way to help people move on, to deal with what's happening to them. So what's this got to do with Psalms of Lament? Well, a couple of things. Firstly, it is very important psychologically to vent those emotions of anger and distress. And spiritually, it's quite important to vent those emotions of anger and distress. And the Psalms give us permission to do that. The psalmists had a strong faith, a bold faith, so bold in fact they could talk to God in that way. It's not a lack of faith. So when we perhaps say to God, why is this happening? Why have you abandoned me? Sometimes it's perceived as a lack of faith. But that's not what the psalmists had. The psalmists had a bold faith because they could say that to God. I know it's a kind of a nicety, but if you think about our church and the way that we worship, perhaps just being given permission to rant is really important psychologically and spiritually. And oh my, do the psalmists rant. One of the most well-known psalms where it's just unmitigated misery and complaining and moaning is Psalm 88. So the important thing to remember is that Psalms of Lament in particular allow us to say anything and everything that we feel to God. He's big enough and omnipotent enough to take it because he loves us. And not to tell him how we truly feel is not building a good relationship with God. Now most, but not all, Psalm 88 doesn't, for example, but most Psalms do show some kind of movement. If you remember that original structure, an address, a complaint, a request, an affirmation, and then finally movement to praise to God. Now in psychological terms for Kubler-Ross, that movement from anger, despair, bargaining through to acceptance is a sort of a reconciliation with events. But for the psalmist in the Psalms of Lament in particular with that movement, it's an anger and a despair and a petition and a why aren't you doing this, God, to a change which says, I'm reconciled with you, I trust you, you have looked after me in the past, I trust you for the future. And that is one of the most important things the Psalms of Lament can do. That really does take us from lament to hope. Hope that God will act. Hope that God will be with us. That movement is important psychologically, but it's important spiritually because it moves us from a place of unhappiness and maybe losing our relationship with God to a place where we are restored with him and our trust is with him. Now, the individual circumstances may not have changed in the slightest, but the point is, our attitude has changed. The way that we perceive the world has changed because we are now trusting in God. Now, there are many ways to assess the Psalms, and one of the people who is top of the league, who I would admire greatly and advise you to read any of his books, is Brueggemann. And he looked at the Psalms slightly differently in the way that we've been talking about with Gunkel. He looked at them in terms of Psalms of orientation, when things were going really well and life was great, sort of like the hymns and the songs of praise. And then he looked at Psalms of disorientation when life was particularly difficult and we seem to be a disconnect between what we know of God and his love and his care for us and the difficult circumstances we currently find ourselves in, and perhaps we can't find God in that either. He called those the Psalms of disorientation, and they are predominantly lament psalms. And then the final category was Psalms of new orientation, where we find ourselves in a new place and a different place, and we are moving forward. And again, that links into our Psalms of Lament. We are going to look at Psalm 13, because that is a classic psalm that shows you the movement. He took the Psalms of Lament and gave them 3 component parts: a complaint, a petition, and a motivation and restoration. And it sort of describes a movement from pain towards some sort of reconciliation with God. Psalm 13 is a classic psalm of lament, which shows that movement very clearly. It's quite a short psalm of lament as well, you'll be glad to know. How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I bear the pain in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all day long? How long shall my enemy be exalted over me? Consider and answer me, O Lord my God. Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep the sleep of death, and my enemy will say, I have prevailed. My foes will rejoice because I am shaken. But I trusted in your steadfast love. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord, because he has dealt bountifully with me. The psalm begins by bewailing the absence of God, and that others, enemies, have the upper hand. The tone and manner of the accusation seem to fix the blame on God. The psalmist appears to be trying to attract God's attention. Look on me and sort it out. If God does not sort it out, the psalmist would die and the enemy would celebrate. It's a motivation for God to act, and a petition as well, to help. This could be seen as a confession of trust and a vow of praise, but it is also why God should intervene. There is a breakdown in the relationship with God, but now there is a memory of past trust and a hope of future rescue. There is a movement from distress to a promise of a happier future. For the psalmist, this is a turn from appealing to God to an assurance that God will act to save them. It's a deliberate turning to God, believing that God has heard and will respond. More importantly, this is not necessarily a change in physical circumstances, but a change in attitude and approach. Well, I hope you found that interesting and can see that hope in the Psalms of Lament is embraced in that movement, where we move from pain and despair and anger and cannot see a way out, to a hope that God will act, to know that God will act and have a brighter hope for the future. So over to you. I'd like you to have a think about that movement and the hope it may bring to people when they're stuck in a particular unhappy situation. I'd like you to look at Psalm 13 again, and last week you looked at Psalm 22. So I'd like you to look at that again, but this time with a view to that movement that is contained within Psalm 22 and how that can help. What are the stages that people are going through, and what hope does it bring at the end for a future life? I hope you will join me again next week. Keep safe. God bless.